Lori never forgot the way people looked at her that day. Not the judge, not the attorneys, the people sitting behind her. Because when Broderick started talking about money during the divorce hearing, he wasn't speaking like a husband ending a marriage. He was speaking like a man discussing a bad investment. At one point, he actually laughed. Then he shook his head and said, "Without me, she'll be lucky to make it." The room went quiet. Nobody laughed with him. Nobody said anything. Lori sat perfectly still. What hurt wasn't the insult. It was knowing their daughter Susan was sitting right outside the courtroom waiting for them. And if she had walked in 10 seconds earlier, she would have heard every word. The strange thing is, years later, after a phone call neither of them saw coming, Broderick would spend months trying to get back into Lori's life. And by then, she finally understood something. The money was never the story. What it revealed about people was, "Welcome to Mr. Graham's story, my beautiful, amazing family. Y'all have been so supportive, and I promise to always do my best to give you the best as I learn and improve every day." If this is your first time watching, comment below with where you're watching from and subscribe to officially join the family. Years before the courtroom, years before the divorce, years before Broderick would sit across from attorneys fighting over money, Lori believed she was living the life she'd always wanted. If someone had asked her friends to describe her back then, most of them would have used the same word: dependable. Lori was the person people called when they needed help moving. The person who remembered birthdays without Facebook reminders. The person who showed up early and stayed late. The person who listened when other people needed to talk. And somehow, no matter how much she had on her own plate, she always found room for someone else's problem. Not because she was trying to impress anyone. That was simply who she was. The funny thing about dependable people is that everyone appreciates them until they start expecting them. Then, appreciation slowly becomes assumption. Back then, Lori hadn't learned that lesson yet. When she met Broderick, he seemed to appreciate everything about her. He was charming in a way that made people feel comfortable almost immediately, confident without appearing arrogant, funny without trying too hard, the kind of man who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with new friends. At least, that was how he appeared. During their first year together, he couldn't stop talking about Lori. Friends noticed. Family noticed. Even Lori noticed. If someone complimented her, Broderick would somehow find a way to add 3 more compliments. If someone asked about his future plans, Lori's name appeared somewhere in the answer. He called her his lucky charm. More than once. At first she laughed whenever he said it. Eventually she stopped correcting him. Because hearing someone talk about you that way feels good. Especially when you love them back. The early years of their marriage were ordinary. And that was part of what made them feel happy. There wasn't some dramatic fairy tale. No luxury lifestyle. No huge house. No extravagant vacations. Just 2 people building a life. They bought a modest home in Florida. Spent weekends doing yard work, argued over paint colors, ordered takeout when neither felt like cooking. Normal things. The kind of life most people actually live. One evening, shortly after their 2nd anniversary, Lori arrived home exhausted after a long day. The kitchen was dark. The house was quiet. She assumed Broderick was still at work. Then the light suddenly flipped on. Surprise! She jumped. Broderick stood in the dining room, grinning like a little kid. The table was covered with candles. Dinner was waiting. Music played softly in the background. Lori stared at him. "What is all this?" He shrugged. "It's Tuesday." "It's Tuesday." "Exactly." She laughed. "People don't usually celebrate Tuesdays." Broderick walked over and kissed her forehead. "That's why I picked Tuesday." Years later, that memory would hurt. Not because anything was wrong with it, because it was genuine. At least she believed it was. The hardest relationships to lose are often the ones that were real at the beginning. For a long time, Lori believed she had found a partner. Not a perfect partner, a real one. Someone willing to build a future alongside her. Someone who cared. Someone who saw her. And honestly, during those early years, Broderick probably did. That was what made everything that followed so confusing, because the man who eventually fought her in court wasn't the man she married. Or maybe he was. Maybe success simply revealed parts of him she hadn't seen yet. Either way, change was coming, and neither of them recognized it at first, because most marriages don't break in a single moment. They change one small disappointment at a time, and the first signs were already beginning to appear. Broderick's career started moving faster than anyone expected, including Broderick. One promotion became another, then another. More responsibility, more recognition, more money. The changes looked positive from the outside, and at first, they were. Lori celebrated every achievement, every raise, every promotion, every professional milestone. She was proud of him, genuinely proud. For a while, Broderick remained the same person, busy, but present, successful, but engaged. Then the phone started ringing more often. Then emails arrived during dinner. Then weekends became workdays. The changes happened slowly enough that nobody treated them as warning signs. Not even Lori. One Friday evening, she spent nearly 2 hours preparing dinner, Broderick's favorite meal, their anniversary. Nothing extravagant, just an evening together, the kind of thing they used to enjoy. At 6 o'clock, she lit candles. At 6:30, she checked her phone. At 7, she received a text. Running late. Sorry. Work thing. Lori stared at the screen, disappointed, but not angry. Things happened. Adults understood that. At 8:30, another message arrived. Can't make it. We'll celebrate tomorrow. Love you. The food sat untouched. The candles eventually burned out. Lori cleaned the kitchen alone. The next day, Broderick apologized. Flowers, dinner reservations, the whole thing. And because she loved him, she accepted the apology. What she didn't know was that he hadn't spent the previous evening at work. A friend would later mention seeing him at a networking event across town. Not cheating, not an affair, simply a choice Lori didn't know had been made. The realization stayed with her, not because of where he went, because of what he prioritized. After that, similar moments started appearing, small enough to dismiss, frequent enough to notice. A canceled weekend trip, a forgotten dinner, a missed family gathering. Always a reason, always an explanation, always something. Whenever Lori brought it up, Broderick gave the same answer. I'm doing this for us. For years, she believed him. The problem was that us gradually started looking more like him. The success changed more than his schedule. It changed his perspective. Without realizing it, Broderick started treating his career as the center of every decision. Everything else adjusted around it, including Lori. One evening she mentioned feeling disconnected. Nothing dramatic, just honest. We haven't spent much time together lately. Broderick sighed, not angrily, tiredly. I'm building something here, Lori. I know. You know how important this is. I do. Then why does it feel like we're having this conversation again? The question landed harder than he intended, because Lori wasn't asking him to quit. She wasn't asking him to choose between work and family. She was asking for one evening, one conversation, one sign that she still mattered as much as she used to. Instead, she found herself apologizing. That should have bothered her more than it did. Looking back, that was the beginning of the imbalance, not the missed dinners, not the late nights. The fact that she slowly became the person adjusting, and Broderick slowly became the person being accommodated. Neither realized where that path was leading, but someone else eventually would. Someone very small, someone who loved her father, and kept waiting for him to show up. Susan changed Lori's life the moment she arrived. The first time Lori held her daughter, everything else seemed smaller. Work, stress, schedules, none of it mattered in quite the same way anymore. For Broderick, the experience was different. He was proud, excited, emotional even. The day Susan was born, he cried. Actually cried. Lori remembered that clearly, because it made her believe they were entering the next chapter together. At first, they were. Broderick attended appointments, changed diapers, took pictures of everything, every smile, every milestone, every tiny achievement. But as the years passed, something changed, not all at once, the same way everything else had changed. Slowly, almost invisibly. When Susan was 6, she had a school performance, nothing major, a simple presentation, children singing songs and reading short speeches, the kind of event parents attend because it matters to their child. Broderick promised he would be there. Twice. Susan reminded him 3 times. The morning of the event, she asked again, "Dad's coming, right?" "Of course." He smiled. "I wouldn't miss it." Susan spent the entire day excited. Then 6 o'clock arrived. The auditorium filled. Parents took seats. Children waited backstage. Susan kept looking toward the entrance. Lori noticed. 5 minutes passed. 10. Then 15. No Broderick. The performance began. Halfway through, Susan stopped scanning the crowd. That was the part Lori remembered. Not disappointment. Recognition. As if her daughter already understood something she shouldn't have understood yet. Afterward, Susan climbed into the car. Still smiling. Still cheerful. Trying her best. Maybe Dad got stuck at work. Lori tightened her grip on the steering wheel. Maybe. Another pause. Then Susan looked out the window. "Do you think he wanted to come?" The question hit harder than any argument Lori had ever had with Broderick, because there wasn't a good answer. There wasn't even a safe answer. The incidents continued. A soccer game, a father-daughter breakfast, a weekend outing, a birthday promise that turned into a last-minute cancellation. Each one seemed small on its own. Together, they told a different story. One evening, Lori found Susan sitting on the edge of her bed, homework untouched, the room unusually quiet. "Everything okay?" Susan nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again. The response was so perfectly childlike, it broke Lori's heart. Finally, Susan looked up. "Mom?" "Yeah?" Susan hesitated, just for a second, then asked the question Lori would never forget. "Does Dad still like spending time with me?" And for the first time, Lori realized her daughter had started noticing the same absence she'd been trying to ignore. The difference was that Lori had chosen Broderick. Susan hadn't, and that made everything feel a lot more serious than missed dinners and canceled plans. The question Susan asked stayed with Lori, not because she didn't know how to answer it, because she knew exactly how to answer it, and she hated the answer. For weeks afterward, she found herself watching Broderick more carefully, not investigating, not searching for proof, simply paying attention. Something felt off. The distance in their marriage had become impossible to ignore. And now that Susan had started noticing it too, Lori couldn't pretend everything was fine anymore. The strange thing was that Broderick seemed completely unaware of the damage he was causing. Or maybe he noticed and simply didn't care. Lori wasn't sure which possibility hurt more. Life continued. School schedules, work schedules, family obligations, the routines that keep people moving, even when their relationships are struggling. Then one ordinary Wednesday afternoon changed everything. The day itself wasn't memorable. No storm, no dramatic argument, no warning. Lori was sitting at the kitchen table trying to schedule a dentist appointment for Susan. Broderick had left his tablet at home. That wasn't unusual. The family calendar was connected to it. So Lori opened the device to check available dates. Nothing suspicious, nothing intentional. She wasn't looking for secrets. She was looking for a dentist appointment. Then, a notification appeared. A name she didn't recognize. A message preview. "Can't stop thinking about last night." For a second, Lori simply stared. The notification disappeared. The room became very quiet. Her eyes remained fixed on the screen. There should have been an explanation, a reasonable one, a professional contact, a misunderstanding, something. Instead, there was only a growing sense of dread. Slowly, she opened the message, then another, then another. The conversation stretched back months. Hundreds of messages, photos, private jokes, dinner plans, hotel reservations, memories, an entire relationship. Not flirtation, not a mistake. A relationship. Lori sat motionless. The tablet rested on the table in front of her. She wasn't crying, not yet. She was reading, and with every message, another piece of her life rearranged itself. One hotel reservation caught her attention. The date looked familiar. She frowned, then remembered. That had been Susan's father-daughter breakfast at school, the one Broderick missed because of an urgent business meeting. Susan had spent days talking about it. Days. The memory landed like a punch. Lori kept reading. Another date. Another excuse. Another promise broken. Another lie. And suddenly the affair stopped being something that happened to her. It became something that happened to Susan too. That realization hurt differently. A message notification appeared from the other woman. The conversation was active, current, comfortable. Neither person sounded guilty. That part was impossible to ignore. There was no hesitation, no concern about being discovered, no evidence that either of them believed they were doing anything wrong. They sounded happy. The thought made Lori physically ill. A few minutes later, her phone rang. Susan's school. Lori answered immediately. The secretary needed permission for an after-school activity. A simple conversation. 2 minutes. Maybe less. When the call ended, Lori sat in silence. The contrast felt surreal. One moment her marriage was collapsing. The next moment, she was discussing permission slips. Life never pauses when people need it to. The clock continued ticking. Cars passed outside. The dishwasher hummed softly in the kitchen. Everything looked exactly the same, except nothing was. That evening, Lori picked Susan up from school. Her daughter climbed into the car carrying a science project, talking excitedly, completely unaware that her mother's world had changed. Lori listened, smiled, asked questions. The entire drive home, she protected Susan from something she hadn't even processed herself. That night, after Susan fell asleep, Lori sat alone at the kitchen table. The tablet remained exactly where she'd left it. The messages still visible, the evidence still undeniable, and for the first time, she allowed herself to connect all the pieces. The late nights, the distance, the excuses, the missed events, the forgotten promises, the emotional absence. Every confusing moment suddenly made sense, not because she had discovered something new, because she had finally discovered the truth. The marriage she had been trying to save wasn't struggling. It had already been abandoned. The only person who didn't know was her. By the end of the week, Lori had learned enough, more than enough. The affair wasn't recent. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It had been happening for a long time. Long enough for Broderick to build an entirely separate life while pretending to maintain the first one. And now there was only one thing left to do. Ask him a question she already knew the answer to. Lori waited until Susan was spending the night at a friend's house. Not because she was afraid, because children should never be forced to carry adult disasters, especially not ones they didn't create. Broderick came home shortly after 7. He looked tired, phone in hand, jacket over one shoulder, the version of himself Lori had become accustomed to seeing. Distracted, busy, elsewhere. He walked into the kitchen, then stopped. Lori was already sitting at the table. The tablet rested in front of her. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then she slid it across the table. Broderick looked down. The color drained from his face. Not dramatically, just enough. He knew. Immediately. Several seconds passed. Then he sat down, slowly. No questions, no confusion, no surprise. And that frightened Lori more than anger would have. Because innocent people react. Broderick looked tired, like a man whose secret had finally caught up with him. How long? Lori asked. He rubbed his forehead. A while. A while? Another pause. Several months. The honesty should have helped. Instead, it made everything worse. Because there was no fight in him. No urgency. No desperation. Nothing. Lori folded her arms. When were you going to tell me? Broderick stared at the table. I don't know. The answer landed heavily. Not because it was cruel. Because it was honest. And honest answers sometimes hurt more. Were you ever going to stop? Silence. Several long seconds passed. Then he looked up. I don't know. There it was again. The same answer. The same emptiness. Lori felt something inside her finally settling. Not healing. Settling. Because she was beginning to understand something. The affair wasn't the biggest betrayal. The indifference was, for years she had been fighting for their marriage, trying to reconnect, trying to communicate, trying to repair things she couldn't fully explain. Meanwhile, Broderick had already left emotionally. The affair simply proved it. What about Susan? The question changed the atmosphere immediately. For the first time, Broderick looked uncomfortable. Not guilty. Uncomfortable. I love Susan. Lori nodded. Then why do you keep disappointing her? No answer came. The silence stretched. Broderick looked away. Again, and once again, the silence said more than words. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. Yet Lori only remembered a few moments clearly. The pauses, the lack of emotion, the strange relief in Broderick's voice, as though being discovered had solved a problem for him. Near the end, Lori asked one final question. When did you stop fighting for us? Broderick stared at his hands, then quietly said something she never forgot. I don't think I ever realized I had. The answer ended the conversation, not because there was nothing left to discuss, because there was nothing left worth saving. And as painful as that realization was, it brought clarity. The marriage hadn't failed that night. It had failed long before either of them sat at that table. Now there was only one battle remaining, and it would reveal a side of Broderick she had never seen before. Lori assumed the divorce would be painful. What she didn't expect was how personal it would become. Broderick wanted out. That much was clear. So she assumed both of them would focus on moving forward. Instead, every discussion became a fight. Every compromise became an argument. Every agreement became another negotiation. The man who hadn't fought for the marriage suddenly wanted to fight for everything else. Money, assets, property, schedules, details. It was exhausting. One afternoon, Lori's attorney called after a mediation session. Prepare yourself. Those were the first words out of his mouth. For what? He rejected every proposal. Lori closed her eyes. Every proposal, not most. Every. Months passed. Meetings multiplied. Legal bills increased. Stress became routine. And throughout all of it, Lori kept one priority, Susan. No matter how difficult things became, she refused to drag her daughter into the conflict. Then came the courtroom hearing, the day Lori would remember for the rest of her life. The day from the hook. Susan was sitting outside with a family friend. The attorneys were reviewing financial matters. The judge listened patiently. The room felt professional, routine, until Broderick started speaking. At first, his comments focused on money. Then they became personal. Then something shifted. Broderick laughed, actually laughed, then shook his head. Without me, she'll be lucky to make it. The room went quiet. Nobody joined him. Nobody smiled. One attorney looked down at her paperwork. Another shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The judge remained expressionless. Lori sat perfectly still. Remained expressionless. Lori sat perfectly still. Not because the words didn't hurt, because she was terrified Susan might hear them. 10 seconds. That was all. If Susan had walked through the courtroom doors 10 seconds earlier, she would have heard every word. That thought stayed with Lori far longer than the insult itself. But the worst moment hadn't happened yet. That came during custody discussions, a conference room, attorneys, schedules, parenting plans, the practical details of raising a child after divorce. At first, everything remained professional. Then Broderick grew frustrated. The conversation focused on responsibilities, school activities, transportation, time commitments, normal parenting obligations. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, shook his head, and said something that changed everything. Every version of this keeps interfering with the life I'm trying to build. Silence. The room froze. Nobody needed clarification. Everyone understood exactly what he meant. Lori looked at him, and for the first time, she stopped seeing her husband. She saw a man annoyed by the responsibilities attached to his own daughter. That was the moment everything changed. Not the affair, not the divorce. That moment. Because Lori realized she was no longer fighting for herself. She was fighting for Susan. And once that became her focus, the outcomes stopped mattering as much. Eventually, the divorce ended. The papers were signed. The marriage was over, but Lori walked away, carrying something more valuable than any settlement. Clarity, painful clarity, the kind that changes the direction of an entire life. And now, she would have to learn something she never expected: how to build a future from the ruins of everything she thought she had. The divorce became official on a Thursday. By Friday morning, Susan still needed breakfast. School still started at the same time. Bills still arrived. Life didn't pause long enough for anyone to recover. That surprised Lori. For years, she had imagined the end of her marriage would feel dramatic. Instead, it felt practical. There were boxes to unpack, forms to sign, utilities to transfer, schedules to rearrange. The emotional collapse everyone imagines rarely arrives all at once. Most of the time, people are too busy surviving. The apartment Lori moved into wasn't terrible. It was smaller, older, less comfortable than the home she'd left behind. But it was theirs. The first night, Susan sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by unopened boxes. "Are we camping?" Lori laughed. "Inside an apartment?" Susan looked around. "Feels like it." That made Lori laugh harder than she had in weeks. For a moment, the stress lifted. Then reality returned. The divorce had left her with far less than she'd expected. Far less than many people believed she deserved. Broderick had fought over everything, and in the end, fighting costs money too. Attorney fees, court costs, unexpected expenses. By the time everything was over, Lori's financial safety net looked very different than it once had. The next few months became a blur. Work, school, groceries, homework, laundry. Repeat. Every dollar mattered. Every decision mattered. One evening, Susan came home carrying a permission slip, a school field trip. Nothing extravagant, just a trip to a science center. The cost wasn't enormous, but it wasn't insignificant either. Susan handed her the form. "Can I go?" Lori looked down at the paper, then at the amount printed near the bottom. She smiled. "We'll figure it out." Susan grinned. "Really? Really?" That night, after Susan fell asleep, Lori sat at the kitchen table reviewing her budget. Again, the numbers didn't magically improve because she stared at them. Still, she stared. Eventually, she found a way. She always found a way. The field trip happened. Susan never knew there had been a problem, and Lori intended to keep it that way. Children deserve childhood, not financial anxiety. The hardest moments often arrived unexpectedly. One afternoon, Lori stood in line at a grocery store. Nothing unusual. A cart with essentials. Bread, milk, fruit, a few household items. The cashier scanned everything, then announced the total. Lori immediately realized she had miscalculated. Not by much. Enough. She quietly removed 2 items. The cashier adjusted the amount. Nobody made a scene. Nobody judged her. The moment lasted less than 60 seconds. Still, it stayed with her. Not because it was humiliating, because it reminded her how much her life had changed. That evening she cried, not in front of Susan, not dramatically, just for a few minutes after putting her daughter to bed. Then she wiped her face, finished the dishes, packed lunches for the next morning, and kept going. That was the reality of rebuilding. Most people don't witness it. They see the result years later. They rarely see the middle, the tired part, the uncertain part, the part where people continue functioning while carrying more than they admit. One night, Lori sat alone at the kitchen table reviewing bills again. The apartment was quiet. The television played softly in the background. She thought Susan was asleep. She wasn't. A few minutes later, Lori heard movement. She quickly wiped her eyes before looking up. Susan stood in the hallway. For a brief second, neither spoke. Then Susan smiled. A small smile. The kind children use when they know something but don't want to embarrass an adult. "I'm thirsty." Lori nodded. "There's juice in the fridge." Susan grabbed a drink, then paused before returning to her room. "Love you, Mom." Lori swallowed. "Love you too." The conversation lasted maybe 10 seconds, but after Susan disappeared into her bedroom, Lori sat perfectly still, because she had a feeling her daughter had seen more than she pretended to, and instead of making it harder, Susan had protected her. The realization broke Lori's heart and healed part of it at the same time. That night, she made herself a promise. No matter how difficult things became, she would not allow this chapter to define the rest of their lives. She didn't know exactly how they would move forward, only that they would, together. And over time, something unexpected started happening. The constant chaos disappeared. The fighting stopped. The legal battles ended. The noise that had dominated their lives slowly faded away. For the first time in years, Lori could hear herself think. And that was where healing finally began. The strange thing about healing is that it rarely announces itself. Most people expect a breakthrough, a revelation, a moment where everything suddenly feels better. For Lori, it happened differently. Life simply became quieter. The attorney calls stopped. The legal emails stopped. The constant anticipation of conflict disappeared. And without all that noise, she noticed something. She was breathing easier. One Saturday morning, she woke up naturally. No alarm, no urgent problem, no stressful message waiting on her phone. Sunlight filtered through the blinds. The apartment felt peaceful, not impressive, not luxurious, peaceful. Susan wandered into the kitchen wearing oversized pajamas. "Do we have plans today?" "Nope." Susan smiled. "My favorite kind of day." Lori laughed. "Mine too," she thought. The routines they built during that period became important. Friday movie nights, Saturday pancakes, Sunday walks, small traditions, simple things, the kind of memories that quietly become foundations. One afternoon, while driving home from school, Susan looked out the window and asked a question. "Mom?" "Yeah?" "Are we okay?" Lori glanced at her. "What do you mean?" Susan shrugged. "I don't know." Then she smiled. "I think we're okay." The statement caught Lori off guard, because she realized Susan wasn't asking. She was telling her, and she was right. They were okay. Not perfect, not finished healing, but okay. Unfortunately, Broderick remained part of the story. His involvement with Susan continued, at least officially. Some weekends happened. Others didn't. Some promises were kept. Others weren't. The pattern hadn't changed much. One Friday evening, Susan arrived home after spending time with her father. She seemed quieter than usual. Lori didn't push. Eventually, while unpacking her overnight bag, Susan spoke. "Dad canceled next weekend." Lori folded a shirt. "Okay." Susan nodded, then continued unpacking. No anger, no tears, no disappointment. And somehow, that worried Lori more. Because children should be disappointed when people let them down. The absence of disappointment suggested something worse. Adjustment. Susan had stopped expecting consistency. That realization sat heavily with Lori. Later that evening they ordered pizza, watched a movie, laughed at something ridiculous neither would remember later. Life moved forward, but Lori couldn't stop thinking about how calmly Susan had accepted the cancellation. Children adapt, sometimes too well. Months continued passing. Slowly, Lori started reclaiming pieces of herself. Old hobbies, friendships, interests she'd neglected during the worst years of her marriage. One friend met her for lunch and said something unexpected. "You look lighter." Lori laughed. "What does that even mean?" Her friend smiled. "You smile more." The comment lingered, because Lori hadn't noticed. Healing often becomes visible to other people before it becomes visible to us. And maybe that was true. Maybe she was changing. Maybe the wounds were still there. But maybe they no longer controlled every decision she made. What Lori didn't realize was that someone new was about to notice those changes too. Someone who would eventually become one of the most important people in her life. And unlike Broderick, he would notice the things everyone else overlooked. Lori met Brandon on a Tuesday. If someone had told her that morning how important he would eventually become, she wouldn't have believed them. The first conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. A school fundraiser, a mutual introduction, polite small talk, nothing remarkable. Then, life moved on. A few weeks later, they crossed paths again, then again, and eventually, the conversations became familiar, comfortable. The relationship didn't begin with romance. It began with consistency. One afternoon, after a school event, Susan struggled to carry a large project to the car. Without interrupting his conversation, Brandon stepped over and helped. No announcement, no performance, no attempt to impress anyone. He simply noticed. That stuck with Lori, because she'd spent years with someone who often noticed only what affected him directly. Over time, more examples appeared. Small things, easy to miss. Brandon remembered details, followed through, showed up when he said he would. One evening, he called while Lori was making dinner. "Did you eat?" Lori laughed. "What kind of question is that?" "A normal one." "I've been busy." "That's not an answer." She looked toward the untouched ingredients on the counter. Brandon sighed. "You forgot again." The fact that he knew surprised her. Not because it was romantic, because it meant he'd been paying attention. And attention is a form of care many people underestimate. For a long time, Brandon remained simply a friend. That was intentional. Lori had Susan to think about. Trust wasn't something she handed out casually anymore. The first real breakthrough happened because of Susan. During a community event, she became frustrated trying to win a game. After several failed attempts, she crossed her arms dramatically. "This game hates me." Brandon looked at the game, then at Susan. "Have you considered the possibility that it's scared of you?" Susan blinked. "What?" "It knows you're competitive." The expression on her face was priceless. A second later, she burst out laughing. The sound made Lori turn around immediately, not because Susan never laughed, because the laughter felt effortless, natural. After the event, Susan climbed into the back seat. Then, casually asked, "Is Brandon coming next time?" Lori smiled to herself. Maybe, just maybe, something new was beginning. And for the first time in years, the possibility of happiness didn't feel impossible. It felt dangerous, which was progress, because dangerous meant she was hopeful again. The problem was that hope would soon face a challenge neither she nor Brandon expected. And that challenge came from someone trying to protect him. By the time Brandon became a regular part of Lori's life, she had stopped waiting for disaster. Not because she thought life was perfect, because she'd finally reached a point where peace felt normal again. That was new. For years she'd been bracing herself for the next problem, the next disappointment, the next difficult conversation. Now her days felt steadier, predictable, and she liked that. Brandon fit naturally into that stability. He wasn't dramatic. He wasn't impulsive. He wasn't trying to rescue anybody. He simply showed up, again and again. The consistency made him easy to trust. Eventually their relationship became serious enough that meeting family was unavoidable. At first, everything seemed fine. Brandon's mother was polite, friendly, thoughtful, the kind of woman who remembered details from previous conversations. Nothing felt uncomfortable, at least not immediately. Then Lori noticed something. The questions became more personal, not rude, careful. The kind of questions people ask when they're trying to understand whether someone belongs in their family's future. Lori understood. She probably would have done the same thing. Still, understanding something doesn't always make it easier. One evening, Brandon called after having dinner with his mother. The moment Lori answered, she sensed something. "What happened?" Brandon laughed softly. "You always know." "What happened?" He sighed. "My mom has concerns." Lori leaned back on the couch. There it was, the thing she'd quietly suspected. "What kind of concerns?" Another pause. "About us." The answer wasn't surprising, but hearing it still hurt. "Okay." "She's worried." "Worried about what?" Brandon hesitated, then chose honesty. "She thinks I've become emotionally invested in a complicated situation." Lori stared toward the ceiling. Complicated situation. What a strange way to describe a person. Still, she understood what his mother meant. Divorced, single parent, history, responsibilities, baggage. People use different words. They usually mean the same thing. A week later, Brandon's mother invited Lori to lunch, without Brandon. That detail alone told her the conversation mattered. The restaurant was quiet, comfortable, The kind of place where difficult discussions could happen without anyone raising their voice. For nearly half an hour, they talked about ordinary things. Work, family, Susan, life. Then Brandon's mother placed her fork down carefully. "Lori, may I be honest?" The question immediately created tension, because honesty is usually announced right before someone says something uncomfortable. Lori nodded. "Of course." The older woman looked down briefly before continuing. "I worry about Brandon." There it was, simple, direct, respectful, and painful. Lori listened, didn't interrupt, didn't defend herself. Brandon's mother continued, "He's always been the kind of person who wants to help everyone." A faint smile crossed her face. "It's one of his best qualities." Then the smile faded. "It's also what worries me." The conversation remained calm. Nobody argued. Nobody became defensive. But the meaning was clear. She was worried Brandon might become responsible for problems he didn't create. At one point, she looked directly at Lori and said, "I don't want him carrying burdens that belong to someone else." The words weren't cruel. That was the difficult part. Cruelty is easier to reject. Concern wrapped in kindness is much harder, because there's no villain, only fear. The lunch ended politely. The drive home felt much longer than it actually was. For the first time in years, Lori felt something she'd hoped never to feel again. Judged, not for anything she'd done, for something she'd survived. That night Brandon called, "How bad was it?" Lori laughed. "Interesting question." "That's not an answer." "No." Several seconds passed. Then Brandon said something she never forgot. "My mother is allowed to have concerns." Lori stayed quiet, but she's not allowed to decide who deserves to be loved. The words settled heavily, because they weren't dramatic. They were sincere, and sincerity carries weight. Still, the situation wasn't resolved, not even close, because Brandon's mother remained unconvinced, and Lori wasn't interested in convincing her. This time, she wasn't going to argue for her worth. If someone wanted to know who she was, they would have to pay attention. And over the next several months, that's exactly what Brandon's mother started doing. After that lunch, Lori made a decision. She wasn't going to perform. She wasn't going to sell herself. She wasn't going to create some polished version of herself designed to win approval. She was too tired for that. So she continued living her life. Work, home, Susan, Brandon, the same things she'd been doing all along. The first change happened during a family barbecue. Nothing dramatic, no confrontation, no emotional conversation, just an ordinary Saturday afternoon. Susan accidentally knocked over a drink. Ice scattered across the patio. The cup rolled beneath a table. Several people looked over. Susan froze immediately, the way children do when they're waiting to see whether they've caused trouble. Lori handed her some napkins. "It's okay." "I'm sorry." "I know." Together, they cleaned up the mess. The entire moment lasted less than a minute. Most people forgot it immediately. Brandon's mother didn't. A few weeks later, another moment happened. One of the younger children became upset after losing a game. Tears, frustration, childhood disappointment. Most adults continued talking. Lori didn't. She crouched beside the child, listened, talked quietly. A few minutes later, the child was smiling again. Nothing remarkable. Nothing extraordinary, just kindness. Again, Brandon's mother noticed, and slowly, observations started replacing assumptions. Over the following months, family gatherings became more frequent. Birthdays, holiday dinners, weekend visits. Nobody forced anything. Life simply continued. The more Brandon's mother observed Lori, the more difficult it became to fit her into the picture she'd originally created. One evening during dinner, Susan interrupted several adults mid-conversation. Lori gently corrected her. Susan apologized immediately. The moment passed. Later, Brandon's mother quietly said, "You handled that well." Lori looked surprised. "What?" "With Susan?" Lori shrugged. "I'm her mother." The older woman smiled. "Not everyone parents that way." The compliment was small, but genuine, and genuine things matter. The biggest shift happened unexpectedly. Brandon's mother experienced a minor health issue. Nothing serious, but several medical appointments became difficult to manage. Family members helped when possible. One afternoon, Lori happened to have time available, so she offered to drive her. No speech, no performance, just an offer. The older woman accepted. The drive lasted 20 minutes. Most of the conversation focused on ordinary topics. Recipes, books, family stories. Yet something changed. The walls lowered. Not completely. Enough. Over time, more moments followed. More conversations, more observations, and slowly Brandon's mother stopped evaluating Lori. She started seeing her. One evening, Brandon smiled during dinner. "What?" He shook his head. "Nothing. That's always a lie." He laughed. "My mom likes you." Lori nearly choked on her drink. "No, she doesn't." "She does." "No. She asked about you 3 times this week." Lori rolled her eyes. But later that night, she found herself smiling. Because maybe things were changing. Not through arguments, not through persuasion, through consistency. And consistency is difficult to ignore. Eventually, Brandon's mother reached a conclusion, one she hadn't expected when this all started. The woman she'd worried about wasn't bringing chaos into Brandon's life. She was bringing stability, and once she accepted that truth, everything else started changing too. The real turning point happened on a Sunday afternoon. A family gathering, good food, too many people talking at once, children running through the backyard, the usual chaos. Lori arrived slightly late because of work. As she walked through the gate, she immediately noticed something. Susan was sitting beside Brandon's mother. The two of them were laughing about something. Completely comfortable, completely relaxed. The sight stopped Lori for a moment. Because it wasn't forced. Nobody was trying. Nobody was performing. They genuinely enjoyed each other. That meant something. Later that evening, while helping clean up after dinner, Brandon's mother approached her. Neither spoke immediately. They continued washing dishes, drying plates, cleaning up. Then the older woman finally said, "I owe you an apology." Lori looked up. "For what?" The woman smiled faintly. "For thinking I understood you before I actually knew you." The honesty surprised her, because sincere apologies are rare, especially from people who don't technically owe them. Brandon's mother continued, "I thought I was protecting my son." "You were, maybe." She shook her head. "But I was judging a situation instead of a person." Neither woman spoke for several seconds. Then the older woman added, "I was wrong." The words carried weight, not because they were dramatic, because they were earned. Over time, the relationship between them became genuine. Not perfect, genuine. And for the first time in years, Lori felt something she had almost forgotten. Safe, emotionally safe. No conflict, no court dates, no betrayal, no uncertainty hanging over every decision. Just peace. The following months became some of the happiest she'd experienced in a very long time. Brandon remained exactly who he'd always been. Steady, reliable, present. The qualities that first attracted her never disappeared. If anything, they became more obvious. One evening, Lori arrived home after a difficult day, the kind where everything seemed to go wrong. She opened the apartment door. Susan sat at the kitchen table working on homework. Brandon sat beside her helping with a science project. Construction paper covered half the table. Markers covered the rest. The scene was ordinary. Yet Lori stood there for several seconds, watching, because years earlier, she thought happiness would arrive through big moments, big achievements, big victories. Instead, happiness looked like this: homework, dinner, people showing up. The realization stayed with her. A few months later, Brandon proposed. The proposal was simple, private, exactly what Lori would have wanted. No crowd, no spectacle, no performance, just two people talking about a future they wanted to share. She said yes. Susan cried, then laughed because she'd cried. The entire evening felt perfect. For a while, Lori genuinely believed the hardest chapter of her life was over. Then the phone rang. Tuesday afternoon. An unfamiliar number. Normally, she would have ignored it. Something made her answer. The man introduced himself as an attorney. At first, she assumed it involved routine paperwork connected to her late grandfather's estate. There had been legal complications for years. Nothing unusual. Then the conversation changed. A family trust had finally been resolved. After years of delays, years of legal issues, years of waiting, the distributions were ready, and Lori was one of the primary beneficiaries. She stopped taking notes, stopped speaking, stopped thinking. The amount was staggering, life-changing, the kind of money that completely alters a person's future. When the call ended, Lori remained standing alone in her office, phone still in hand. Most people imagine excitement in moments like that, joy, celebration, but her first reaction wasn't excitement. It was concern, because she'd seen what money could do to people. And deep down, she had a feeling this wasn't going to change only her financial future. It was about to reveal something about everyone around her, including one man she hadn't thought about in a very long time, a man named Broderick, and within weeks, he would prove her right. For the first few days after the attorney's phone call, Lori walked around feeling like she was carrying a secret, not because she was hiding it, because she hadn't fully processed it. The numbers still felt unreal. Every time she thought about them, her mind drifted back to the same place. The apartment, the grocery store, the nights spent calculating bills at the kitchen table, the years she spent wondering whether she'd ever truly feel secure again. Now, suddenly, security wasn't a question anymore. The first person she told was Brandon. She waited until Susan had gone to bed. Then she handed him the paperwork. "Read that." Brandon adjusted his glasses, started reading. Several minutes passed. Then he stopped, looked at her, looked back at the documents, then looked at her again. "Lori." She laughed nervously. "I know. No." He shook his head. "I don't think you do." For the next hour, they talked, not about luxury cars, not about expensive vacations, not about mansions. They talked about practical things, paying off debt, college for Susan, long-term security, helping family members if needed. The conversation reassured Lori, because Brandon never once talked about what the money could buy him, only what it could do for her. That mattered, more than she expected. The next conversation happened with Susan. Lori simplified everything, explained only what a teenager needed to understand. Susan listened carefully, then immediately asked, "So, are we rich now?" Lori laughed. Children always find the shortest route to the important question. "It means we don't have to worry as much." Susan considered that, then nodded. "Good." A pause. Then, "Can we still do pizza Fridays?" Lori laughed again. "Absolutely." "Okay." As far as Susan was concerned, the crisis had been successfully avoided. That simple reaction became one of Lori's favorite memories. Unfortunately, adults rarely respond the way children do. Within a few weeks, the news started spreading. Not publicly, not dramatically, quietly, through relatives, legal contacts, family conversations, the usual pathways information travels. Most reactions were wonderful. Friends celebrated. Family members called. People who genuinely cared about Lori were simply happy for her. Those conversations felt normal. Then came the others, the strange ones. One distant cousin who hadn't called in nearly 5 years suddenly wanted to reconnect. A former acquaintance reached out just to catch up. Someone else called asking about investment opportunities before asking how she was doing. None of it was outrageous, just noticeable. One afternoon, Lori met an old acquaintance for coffee. Halfway through the conversation, the woman leaned forward and asked, "So when are you quitting work?" Lori blinked. "What? You don't need to work anymore." The statement felt strange, not because of the money, because the woman hadn't asked a single question about her actual life. Not one. No questions about Susan. No questions about Brandon. No questions about anything. Only the inheritance. Lori smiled politely. "I haven't decided to quit." The woman looked confused. "Why not?" Lori didn't bother explaining. Because some people see money as the destination. Others see it as a tool. The difference is difficult to explain. As the weeks passed, Lori found herself paying closer attention to people. Not suspicious, observant. The inheritance wasn't changing anyone. It was revealing them. Some people became warmer. Others became curious. A few became opportunistic. The differences were subtle, but impossible to miss once she noticed them. One evening, Brandon's mother came over for dinner. Eventually, the trust came up naturally. She listened, congratulated Lori, asked a few practical questions, then changed the subject. That was it. No obsession, no fascination, no strange behavior. Later, after she left, Lori mentioned it. Your mother handled that well. Brandon looked confused. Handled what? The inheritance. He laughed. Lori, she was happy for you. I know. So? Lori smiled, because he didn't understand what she meant. And that was exactly the point. The people who loved her still saw her the same way. The money hadn't changed her value in their eyes. Only her circumstances. That realization became important later. Because 3 weeks after the attorney's phone call, Lori received a text message. A very familiar text message. One she hadn't expected. Not anymore. Her phone buzzed while she was preparing dinner. She glanced down and immediately froze. Broderick. The message was short. Hey, been thinking about you lately. Lori stared at the screen. Then read it again. Years had passed. Years. Communication between them had been limited almost entirely to matters involving Susan. And now, suddenly, he was thinking about her. The timing was impossible to ignore. Lori felt no excitement, no anger, no sadness, only curiosity, because she already suspected what was happening. And unfortunately, she was right. The inheritance wasn't changing people. It was exposing them, and Broderick was about to reveal more than anyone. At first, the messages seemed harmless, friendly, casual, the kind of communication people might expect from former spouses who had finally reached a peaceful place. At least, that was how Broderick framed it. The problem was that Lori knew him too well. Timing matters, and his timing was terrible. A few days after the first message came another, then a phone call, then another. Nothing inappropriate, nothing aggressive, just consistent. Far more consistent than he'd been during most of their marriage. One Saturday morning, Susan looked up from breakfast. Dad called me yesterday. Lori glanced over. Oh? Susan nodded. He talked for almost an hour. That alone was unusual, very unusual. Over the following weeks, the pattern intensified. More calls, more invitations, more attention, more effort. Eventually, Susan noticed. One evening, she sat on the balcony beside Lori watching the sunset, then asked, Can I say something? Always. Susan hesitated, then shrugged. I think Dad wants something. Lori almost smiled, not because it was funny, because it was accurate. What makes you think that? Susan leaned back in her chair. He never acted like this before. There it was, the observation Lori had been trying not to say out loud. Children often notice things adults complicate. And Susan wasn't wrong. Broderick had changed. The question was why. A few weeks later, Broderick asked Lori to dinner. Not with Susan, just Lori. The request alone felt strange. Curiosity won. She agreed. The dinner took place at a quiet waterfront restaurant. Nothing romantic, nothing dramatic. Just two people with a complicated history. Broderick arrived early. Another unusual development. As they sat down, he seemed nervous. Not theatrical. Genuinely uncomfortable. The conversation started with safe topics. Work, Susan, life. Then Broderick finally shifted directions. I owe you an apology. Lori took a sip of water. For which part? The answer slipped out before she could stop it. Broderick laughed awkwardly. Fair. Several moments passed. Then he became serious. I wasn't a good husband. Lori remained silent. I know. I wasn't a good father either. That one landed differently, because for the first time, he sounded sincere. The problem was that sincerity arriving years late creates difficult questions. Why now? That question remained between them for the rest of the evening, even when nobody said it. As dinner continued, Broderick talked about regrets, mistakes, lost opportunities, things he wished he'd done differently. Lori listened, occasionally responded, mostly listened, because actions had already taught her everything she needed to know. Toward the end of dinner, Broderick asked, "Do you ever think about us?" The answer came easily, "No." The surprise on his face was immediate, not anger, surprise, as though he expected the past to occupy more space in her life than it actually did. The truth was simple. She'd spent too many years rebuilding to keep living there. When the dinner ended, Lori drove home feeling strangely calm. Not because she believed him, not because she didn't, because she finally understood something. Broderick wasn't reaching backward because of love. He was reaching backward because of loss. And those are not the same thing. The problem was that Broderick hadn't finished trying, and soon he would ask for something Lori never intended to give him again. Several months passed. The attention continued. The apologies continued. The attempts at reconnection continued. And slowly, Broderick stopped hiding what he wanted. The conversation happened on a quiet afternoon, a small cafe, a table near the water, no attorneys, no judges, no conflict, just two people sitting across from each other. For a while, they talked about Susan, then the future, then life. Eventually, Broderick looked at her and said, "I keep thinking about what we had." Lori remained silent. "We had a family." A pause. "We had something good." He wasn't wrong. Years ago, they had. The problem was that he was remembering the beginning while ignoring everything that came afterward. Broderick leaned forward. "I know I don't deserve another chance." Lori watched him carefully. "But if there's even a possibility." His voice faded. The sentence remained unfinished. It didn't need finishing. The meaning was obvious. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Lori asked a single question. One question, the only question that mattered. "Would you be sitting here if there was no inheritance?" Silence. Broderick looked away. That was it. That was the answer. Not the silence itself. The hesitation, the direction of his eyes. The fact that he couldn't answer immediately. Several long seconds passed. Finally he sighed, and quietly said, "I don't know." The words sounded familiar. Years earlier, he'd given the exact same answer when she asked when he stopped fighting for their marriage. "I don't know." Back then, the answer had broken her heart. Now it didn't, because she wasn't waiting for him anymore. She hadn't been for a long time. Broderick stared down at the table. "I've had a lot of time to think." "So have I." The conversation felt strangely peaceful, because the decision had already been made. Long ago. Broderick simply hadn't known it yet. Finally, Lori spoke. Not angrily, not emotionally, just honestly. "You keep talking about what we had." Broderick looked up. "But that's not what I think about." "What do you think about?" The answer came immediately. Susan. The name settled between them, because that had always been the real story. Not money, not divorce, not regret. Susan, the little girl who spent years waiting for her father to show up. The little girl who deserved consistency. The little girl who loved him even when he disappointed her. Lori held his gaze. "If you'd fought this hard for your family back then, we wouldn't be sitting here." For once, Broderick had no response, no argument, no defense, nothing, because some truths arrived too late to challenge. The conversation ended shortly afterward. No dramatic goodbye, no revenge speech, no emotional explosion, just acceptance. As Lori walked back to her car, she realized something. The inheritance hadn't changed her worth. It had only revealed who recognized it. Brandon loved her before he knew about the trust. His mother changed her opinion before she knew about the money. Susan never needed wealth to see her value. Only Broderick had required proof. A year later, Lori sat on the back patio of her new home. Not extravagant, not flashy, simply comfortable. Susan was laughing nearby. Brandon stood at the grill making dinner. His mother and Susan were arguing about a recipe. Everyone seemed happy, the kind of happiness that doesn't need attention, Lori looked around quietly, then thought about the courtroom, the laughter, the humiliation, the prediction Broderick made years earlier. Without me, she'll be lucky to make it. The memory no longer hurt, because he had been wrong, not because of the inheritance, because of everything she survived before it. And in the end, the money wasn't the story. The money simply revealed who people truly were. The people who loved Lori before the inheritance stayed. The people who appeared afterward revealed themselves. And by the time Broderick finally understood what he had lost, Lori no longer needed him to understand it at all. I want to hear from you. At what point did Broderick lose Lori forever? Was it the affair? The courtroom humiliation? The way he treated Susan? Or the moment he came back after hearing about the inheritance? Comment below and tell me the exact moment you stopped rooting for him.
Thank you for watching Mr. Graham Stories, my beautiful, amazing family.